Section 20 of St. Augustin by Louis Bertrand, translated by Vincent O'Sullivan. 4. Augustin, a priest. This halt did not last long. Soon was going to begin for Augustin the time of tribulation, that of his struggles and apostolic journeys. And first he must mourn his son Adeodatus, that young man who seemed destined to such great things. It is indeed most probable that the young monk died at Thagaste during the 3 years that his father spent there. Augustin was deeply grieved, but as in the case of his mother's death, he mastered his sorrow by all the force of his Christian hope. No doubt he loved his son as much as he was proud of him. It will be remembered what words he used to speak of this youthful genius, whose precocity frightened him. Little by little his grief quieted down, and in its place came a mild resignation. Some years later he will write about Adeodatus, "Lord, early didst thou cut off his life from this earth, but I remember him without a shadow of misgiving. My remembrance is not mixed with any fear for his boyhood, or the youth he was, or the man he would have been. No fear. What a difference between this and the habitual feelings of the Jansenists who believe themselves his disciples." While Augustine thinks of his son's death with a calm and grave joy which he can scarce hide, those of Port Royal could only think in trembling of the judgment of God. Their faith did not much resemble the luminous and confident faith of Augustine. For him, salvation is the conquest of joy. At Thagaste he lived in joy. Every morning, in awaking before the forest pines, glistening with the dews of the morning, he might well say with a full heart, "My God, give me the grace to live here under the shades of thy peace, while awaiting that of thy paradise." But the Christians continued to watch him. It was to the interest of a number of people that this light should not be hid under a bushel. Perhaps a snare was deliberately laid for him. At any rate, he was imprudent enough to come out of his retreat and travel to Hippo. He thought he might be safe there because, as the town had a bishop already, they would not have any excuse to get him consecrated in spite of himself. An inhabitant of Hippo, a clerk of the imperial ministry of the interior, begged his spiritual assistance. Doubts, he maintained, still delayed him on the way to an entire conversion. Augustine alone could help him to get clear of them. So Augustine, counting already on a new recruit for Thagaste monastery, went over there at the request of this official. Now, if there was a bishop at Hippo, a certain Valerius, priests were lacking. Furthermore, Valerius was getting on in years. Originally Greek, he knew Latin badly, and not a word of Punic, a great hindrance for him in his duties of judge, administrator, and catechist. The knowledge of the two languages was indispensable to an ecclesiastic in such a country where the majority of the rural population spoke only the old Carthaginian idiom. All this proves to us that Catholicism was in bad shape in the diocese of Hippo. Not only was there a lack of priests, but the bishop was a foreigner, little familiar with African customs. There was a general demand for a native to take his place, one young, active, and well enough furnished with learning to hold his own against the heretics and the schismatics of the party of Donatus, and also sufficiently able to watch over the interests of the church at Hippo, and above all to make it prosperous. Let us not forget that at this time, in the eyes of a crowd of poor wretches, Christianity was first and foremost the religion which gave out bread. Even in those early days, the church did its best to solve the eternal social question. While Augustine was at Hippo, Valerius preached a sermon in the basilica in which precisely he deplored this lack of priests the community suffered from. Mingled with the congregation, Augustine listened, sure that he would be unrecognized, but the secret of his presence had leaked out. People pointed to him while the bishop was preaching. The next thing was that some furious enthusiasts seized hold of him and dragged him to the foot of the episcopal chair, yelling, "Augustine a priest! Augustine a priest!" Such were the democratic ways of the Church in those days. The inconveniences are plain enough. What is certain is that if Augustine had resisted, he might have lost his life, and that the bishop would have provoked a riot in refusing him the priesthood. In Africa, religious passions are not to be trifled with, especially when they are exasperated by questions of profit or politics. In his heart the bishop was delighted with this brutal capture, which gained him the distinction of such a well-known fellow-worker. There and then he ordained the Thagaste monk, and so, as Augustine's pupil, Posidius, the future bishop of Guelma, puts it, this shining lamp which sought the darkness of solitude was placed upon the lampstand. Augustine, who saw the finger of God in this adventure, submitted to the popular will. Nevertheless, he was in despair, and he wept at the change they were forcing on him. Then some of those present, mistaking the significance of his tears, said to console him, "Yes, you are right. The priesthood is not good enough for your merits, but you may be certain that you will be our bishop." Augustine well knew all that the crowd meant by that, and what it expected of its bishop. He who only thought of leaving the world grew frightened at the practical cares he would have to take over, and the spiritual side of his jurisdiction frightened him no less. To speak of God, proclaim the word of God, he deemed himself unworthy of so high a privilege. He was so ill prepared. To remedy this fault of preparation as well as he could, he desired that he might be given a little leisure till the following Easter. In a letter addressed to Valerius, and no doubt intended to be made public, he humbly set forth the reasons why he asked for delay. They were so apposite and so creditable that very likely the bishop yielded. The new priest received permission to retire to a country house near Hippo. His flock, who did not feel at all sure of their shepherd, would not have let him go too far off. He took up his duties as soon as possible. Little by little he became, to all intents, the coadjutor of the bishop, who charged him with the preaching and the baptism of catechumens. These were the two most important among the episcopal prerogatives. The bishops made a point of doing these things themselves. Certain colleagues of Valerius even grew scandalized that he should allow a simple priest to preach before him in his own church, but soon other bishops, struck by the advantages of this innovation, followed the example of Valerius and allowed their clerks to preach even in their presence. The priest of Hippo did not lose his head among so many honors. He felt chiefly the perils of them, and he regarded them as a trial sent by God. "I've been forced into this," he said, "doubtless in punishment of my sins, for from what other motive can I think that the second place at the helm should be given to me who do not even know how to hold an oar?" Meanwhile, he had not relinquished his purpose of monastic life. Though a priest, he meant to remain a monk. It was heartbreaking for him to be obliged to leave his monastery at Thagaste. He spoke of his regret to Valerius, who, perceiving the usefulness of a convent as a seminary for future priests, gave him an orchard belonging to the church of Hippo, that he might found a new community there. So was established the monastery, which was going to supply a great number of clerks and bishops to all the African provinces. Among the ruins of Hippo, that old Roman and Phoenician city, they searched for the place where Augustine's monastery stood, without much hope of ever finding it. Some have thought it to locate it upon that hill where the water brought from the near mountains by an aqueduct used to pour into immense reservoirs, and where today rises a new basilica which attracts all eyes out at sea. Behind the basilica is a convent where the Little Sisters of the Poor lodge about 100 old people. So is maintained among the African Mussulmans the remembrance of the grand Christian marabout. One might possibly wish to see there a building more in the pure and quiet taste of antiquity, but after all, the piety of the intention is enough. This hospital serves admirably to call up the memory of the illustrious bishop who was charity itself. As for the basilica, Africa has done all she can to make it worthy of him. She has given her most precious marbles and one of her fairest landscapes as a frame. It is chiefly in the evening, in the closing dusk, that this landscape reveals all its special charm and its finer values. The roseate glow of the setting sun throws into sharp relief the black profile of the mountains which command the Sea-Baus Valley. Under the mustering shadows, the pallid river winds slowly to the sea. The gulf, stretching limitless, shines like a slab of salt strangely bespangled. In this atmosphere without mists, the sharp outlines of the coast, the dense movelessness of the aspect has an indescribable effect. It is like a hitherto unknown and virginal revelation of the earth. Then the stars bloom out with a flame and hallucinating palpability. Charles's Wain, burning low on the gorges of the Edelf, seems like a golden wagon rolling through the fields of heaven. A deep peace settles upon farmland and meadow country, only broken by a watchdog's bark now and then. But it matters not which spot is chosen in the surroundings of Hippo to place Augustine's monastery. The view will be equally beautiful. From all parts of the plain, mounded by heaps of ruins, the sea can be seen, a wide bay circled in soft, bland curves like at Naples, all around an arena of mountains, the green ravines of the Eduf and its wooded slopes. Along the sur-based roads rise the great sonorous pines, and through them wanders the Aeolian complaint of the sea winds, blue of the sea, blue of the sky, noble foliage of lilies. Ancient groves, it is one of Lamartine's landscapes under a more burning sun. The gaiety of the mornings there is a physical luxury for heart and eyes, when the newborn light laughs upon the painted cupolas of the houses, and dark blue veils float between the walls, clearing white of the steep streets. Among the olives and orange trees of Hippo, Augustine must have seen happy days pass by, as at Thagaste. The rule he had given the convent, which he himself obeyed like anyone else, was neither too slack nor too strict, in a word such as it should be for men who have lived in the culture of letters and works of the mind. There was no affectation of excessive austerity. Augustine and his monks wore very simple clothes and shoes, but suitable for a bishop and his clerks. Like laymen, they wore the bearus, a garment with a hood which seems very like the ancestor of the Arab burnous. To keep an even line between daintiness and negligence in costume, to have no exaggeration in anything, is what Augustine aimed at. The poet Rutilius Nematianus, who about this time was attacking the sordid and culture-hating monks with somber irony, would have had a chance to admire a restraint and decorum in the Hippo monastery which recalled what was best in the manners of the ancient world. At table, a like moderation. Vegetables were generally provided, and sometimes meat when anyone was sick or guests arrived. They drank a little wine, contrary to the regulations of St. Jerome, who condemned wine as a drink for devils. When a monk infringed the rule, his share of the wine was stopped. Through some remains of fastidious habits in Augustine, or perhaps because he had nothing else, the table service he used himself was silver. On the other hand, the pots and dishes were of earthenware, or wood, or common alabaster. Augustine, who was very temperate in eating and drinking, seemed at table to pay attention only to what was being read or talked about. He cared very little what he ate, provided the food was not a stimulant to lubricity. He used to say to those Christians who paraded a Pharisaic severity, "It is the pure heart which makes pure food." Then, with his constant desire for charity, he prohibited all spiteful gossip in the conversation of the refectory. In those times of religious struggle, the clerics ferociously blackened each other's characters. Augustine caused to have written on the walls a distich which ran thus: "He who takes pleasure in slandering the life of the absent should know he is unworthy to sit at this table." One day, says Posidius, some of his intimate friends, even other bishops, having forgotten this sentence, he reproached them warmly, and very much perturbed, he cried out that he was going to remove those verses from the refectory, or rise from table and withdraw to his cell. I was present with many others when this happened. It was not only slanderous talk or interior dissensions which troubled Augustine's peace of mind. He combined the duties of priest or of a head of a convent and of an apostle. He had to preach, instruct the catechumens, battle against the disaffected. The town of Hippo was very unruly, full of heretics, schismatics, pagans. Those of the party of Donatus were triumphant, driving the Catholics from their churches and lands. When Augustine came into the country, Catholicism was very low, and then the ineradicable Manichees continued to recruit proselytes. He never stopped writing tracts disputing against them, overwhelming them under the close logic of his arguments. At the request of Donatists themselves, he had an argument with one of their priests, a certain Fortunatus, in the baths of Socius at Hippo. He reduced this man to silence and to flight. Not in the least discouraged were the Manichees. They sent another priest. If the enemies of the Church showed themselves stubborn, Augustine's own congregation were singularly turbulent, hard to manage. The weakness of old Valerius must have allowed a good many abuses to creep into the community. Ere long, the priest of Hippo had a foretaste of the difficulties which awaited him as bishop. Following the example of Ambrose, he undertook to abolish the custom of feasts in the basilicas and on the tombs of the martyrs. This was a survival of paganism, of which the festivals included gluttonous eating and orgies. At every solemnity, and they were frequent, the pagans ate in the courts and under the porticos around the temples. In Africa, above all, these public repasts gave an opportunity for repugnant scenes of stuffing and drunkenness. As a rule, the African is very sober, but when he does let himself go, he is terrible. This is quite easily seen today in the great Muslim feasts, when the rich distribute broken bits of meat to the poor of their district. As soon as these people used to drink water and to eat a little boiled rice, have tasted meat or drunk only 1 cup of wine, there is no holding them. There are fights, stabbing matches, a general brawl in the hovels. Just picture this popular debauch in full blast in the cemeteries and the courts of the basilicas, and it will be understood why Augustin did his best to put an end to such scandals. For this purpose he joined hands first of all with his bishop Valerius, and then with the primate of Carthage, Aurelius, who shall be henceforth his firmest support in his struggle against the schismatics. During Lent, this subject fitting in naturally with the season, he spoke against these pagan orgies, and this gave rise to a good deal of discontent outside. Easter went by without trouble, but the day after the Ascension, the people of Hippo were used to celebrate what they call the Joy Day by a traditional good feed and drink. The day before, which was the religious festival, Augustine intrepidly spoke against the Joy Day. They interrupted the preacher. Some of them shouted that as much was done at Rome in St. Peter's Basilica. At Carthage they danced round the tomb of St. Cyprian to the shrilling of flutes. Amid the dull blows of the gongs, mimes gave themselves up to obscene contortions, while the spectators sang to the clapping of their hands. Augustine knew all about that. He declared that these abominations might have been tolerated in former times so as not to discourage the pagans from becoming converts, but that henceforth the people, altogether Christian, should give them up. In the end he spoke with such touching eloquence that the audience burst into tears. He believed he had won. The next day it was all to do over again. Agitators had worked among the crowd to such an extent that a riot was feared. Nevertheless, Augustine, preceded by his bishop, entered the basilica at the hour of service. At the same moment the Donatists were banqueting in their church, which was quite near. Through the walls of their own church the Catholics heard the noise of this carouse. It required the coadjutors' most urgent remonstrances to keep them from imitating their neighbors. The last murmurs died down, and the ceremony ended with the singing of the sacred hymns. Augustine had carried the position, but the conflict had got to the point that he had to threaten the people with his resignation, and as he wrote to Alpius, to shake out on them the dust from his clothes. All this promised very ill for the future. He who already considered the priesthood as a trial saw with terror the bishopric drawing near.